killed, and it was a little more of a quarrel between two families, so a little different than what I did with it. Having both of those stories come at me so close together, and I really was fascinated with the idea of doing a story that has such a significant and deep backstory, so that you're actually kind of going back and forth a little bit. If that makes sense, I do often take inspiration from something, but I tend not to feel tied to it. So, for example, I was reading the newspaper from Red Wing, Minnesota, and there was a body found in the Mississippi River. At first, they called the sheriff on the Minnesota side of the river, but when his deputies got there, they decided, no, actually, the body was closer to the Wisconsin side of the river.
Oh, my goodness. There's definitely a book in there.
Well, there was, and it's called Point No Point. I just thought this was so hysterical. My small town, Stockholm, Wisconsin, is on the Mississippi, and it's a big lake. It's between Wisconsin and Minnesota, and there's a number of small towns that are around it. So what I did was I put the body in the middle of the lake. First, the big boat comes out from Red Wing. Oh, it's not their body. Because all of things meet at this point in the lake. And so it ends up, of course, being poor Claire Watkins' body, and she's like in a rowboat. I just thought that was such a hoot that they would be arguing over whose body was it.
That was a dark story.
Yes.
The little twist was, very, very well done.
Thank you. Thank you. That maybe is my favorite book in that series. It's hard to have a favorite. Just kind of the breadth and depth that I took on in that book was really so interesting. Plus, I have to tell you, it had one of my very favorite characters, which was the editor of the newspaper.
Yes.
What's interesting about the Claire Watkins mystery series is it's written from different points of view. So you have Claire's point of view, but you often have other people's points of view. And I love writing from his point of view, both how he's much older, he's seen a lot of water under the bridge, and just his view on things was really, really fun to write.
Do you write every day?
I don't write absolutely every day. When I call it kind of cranking on a book, I do try to write almost every day because it keeps me in the world of the book. If you take too much of a break sometimes, then it's almost like you have to backtrack a little bit. Because I live with another writer, weekends really don't mean that much to us. We tend to write every day. When I'm really working hard on a book, I try to write 3 to 5 pages a day. And what that means is I'll start out by going over the previous 3 to 5 pages that I wrote the day before just to get back into that world again, and often to do some corrections and stuff, and then go forward another 3 or 5 pages. If I do that, it really keeps the momentum going. And Pete does pretty much is similar, although he often will write more than one book at a time, which I don't do quite as much. I will maybe write a poem or 2 once in a while. I keep steady at it, but I take breaks. I'll go on vacation from time to time or just take a day off. But I feel better after I've written a few pages.
One of the things we do with this podcast is we make sure before we talk to somebody that we've at least read one of their books so that we can at least sound like we know what we're talking about. Well, I read 3 of yours because you have such diverse subjects. How do you research your locales and your timelines? Because they're all a little bit different.
One thing Peter and I have learned to do is try not to put any specific date or time in a book because it can trip you up sometimes. The Claire Watkins Mystery Series, I bought a house in this little town, Stockholm, Wisconsin. It has now a population of 87 people. We've grown a little. And it's right on the Mississippi. Beautiful, under the bluffs, beautiful little town. And I got kind of fascinated by life. I'm more of a city girl. I lived in New York City for 4 years. I've lived in Minneapolis. It was interesting to me how things happened in a small town. Also, when I was doing research for that book, I got to be quite close with the sheriff. He was fabulous. You need to understand that the sheriff, deputy sheriff in a small county, it's very, very different than in the big city. And also it was interesting the things I had to do research on, like for bone harvest, I had to research about pesticides. I had to research about chickens. I had to research about things you wouldn't think about, even though it's a contemporary book. And I'll tell you what's interesting is pesticides were the hardest thing to research. I went to the agronomist in our county, and he would have nothing to do with me. He would not talk to me about what the pesticides were doing to us, that they were putting in the fields all around us. And I found that utterly fascinating. When I wrote the book on my grandmother, I found out even more deeply how much I love doing research. I have to watch myself because it can be a trap. You can really fall down some very deep holes. Kind of shake yourself 3 hours later and go, why do I need to know what kind of bee you would find on the prairie at blah, blah, blah.
We hear that so much. You authors just love the research.
It is fascinating. So for the Streel, which is set in Ireland where I've been, and then in New York where I've lived, and then Summit Avenue in St. Paul where I've been and lived, it was really, really, really fun to do a lot of that research. And then Deadwood, Peter, my guy, is a poker player. For a while, Deadwood was almost the only place you could play poker. We would visit, and I would do research while he's losing money. Now he's yelling at me. He just heard me say that. But what's interesting, I read diaries of women from that time period. I read novels that were written during that time period. So I do a lot of that kind of very first-person research. And then, of course, visiting the place is just so important. Not always, but often the research will give you hints to the mystery that you would not have had otherwise. For example, I just found out around the time of the next book I'm working on, the 1880s, they started coloring arsenic blue so that people wouldn't mistake it for something else. That's going to be very helpful.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Huh.
See?
Learn something new every day. Here's the big question. What are you working on now?
I'm so delighted to talk about it. Past the hard part for me. I'm working on the next book about Brigid. The title of it is The Big Sugar. It's set in Cheyenne, Wyoming, which is where Brigid goes next. When I started this book about Brigid, I wanted to write a book as she goes across the western frontier. I'm envisioning that the book after this will be in Salt Lake City, and then she's going to go to San Francisco. And then maybe if I live long enough, she'll go back to Ireland. That would be really wonderful. I'm at page 227 as of today. I did my writing already. And I would say within 100 pages of the end. And I know pretty much everything. Not that there can't be surprises, because those are lovely. It's just seat in the chair and keep at it. So I'm real excited. And I went to Cheyenne, believe it or not, during COVID. My sister and I drove down. I got to do some research there. So that was really lovely.
Now, do you write longhand or computer?
Mainly computer. I wrote my first novel, which was not a mystery, on a typewriter. I do not need to go back to that again. And I also got a Macintosh computer the very first day they were available. I was living in New York City. I was living with a guy who was a computer programmer, and we got a Macintosh, and I have never looked back. Having said that, I write all my poetry in longhand. I often start things in longhand. So when I'm starting a new book, I always get a notebook, and I often start the beginnings of things in my notebook in longhand, because for some reason I often find that less threatening, or maybe even just lots of times I'm on the fly, and so it's easier to just write something down in my notebook when I have an idea where a chapter should start. Yes, I love working on the computer. Making any changes, you decide a character needs a different name, It was horrible when you had to type out all that.
When the new book is out, please let us know so we can share it with our listeners. Be one of the first to read it because I just loved Brigid.
Thank you so much. This is a very interesting book, and also I'd love to talk with you more about it when it comes out because it got a really interesting history too.
Oh, good.
Now you've intrigued us.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I meant to do.
Yes.
Your children's books, are those mysteries?
I did write a couple mysteries for kids, kind of middle grade. I've also written a picture book called Sleep Like a Tiger that won a Caldecott Honor Award, which I'm very proud of. And I have another kids' book coming out in a year called Drekkie. To go back to my rug hooking, I was very lucky that I got to do a residency in Iceland about 4 years ago. I was there for 5 weeks. I worked in a small town in the north of Iceland called Blönduós. My studio looked out over the North Arctic Ocean.
Oh, wow.
It was amazing. And I had gone there with the idea for a middle grade book that I knew the opening. I even wrote the opening. I couldn't go any further. I just didn't know where to go with it. And when I got to Iceland and they believe in trolls and they believe in dragons, all of a sudden I knew the whole rest of the book. It starts out on the Mississippi River in Wisconsin, but it moves to Iceland very quickly. I wrote a good chunk of it while I was rug hooking in Iceland.
Wow.
It's been such a pleasure to get to know you too.
Oh, Mary, it's been delightful.
Thank you so much.
Well, Mary, enjoy your evening, and we thank you again so much for talking with us.
Can you let our listeners know your website so they can learn more about you and your books?
Yes, it's at www.marylogue.com. And I love to hear from them. And some of my rugs are on there too.
Mary, thank you again. We'll hopefully hear from you soon.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I will have to say I found Mary's books very, very compelling. She has the 3 series, and they're all different in different ways. The Streel is about a woman who comes from Ireland and has to rebuild her life, and that happens back in the 1800s. Then she has her Claire Watkins series. That happens in the current age. Then she has her Killer Librarian series, which is so much fun. It's like a rom-com, but it's really kind of crazy and wacky, and I enjoyed that one very, very much.
Well, I think Mary herself is a very interesting character. I encourage anyone to pull up her website and look at these rugs that she has created.
Oh, they're beautiful.
They are truly works of art. She is painting with fiber. They are beautiful.
Yes.
And then just her being a poet and then
children's author.
She's very well-rounded. She makes me feel lazy.
I could have talked to her all day about her books. We wish her all the best. We look forward to seeing what she has coming down the road.
Definitely.
Trivia. Last week's question was, in the Mystery Golden Age, Robert Knox wrote that, quote, a detective story must have as its main interest the unraveling of a mystery whose elements are clearly presented to the reader at an early stage of the proceedings, and whose nature is such as to arouse curiosity, a curiosity which is gratified at the end, unquote. What were detective stories considered in the Golden Age? A. Trashy literature. B. Games. C. Serious literature. Or D. Ghastly. The answer is B. Games. The rules of the games and Golden Age mysteries were considered games, they were codified.